What if one of the most significant shipwrecks from Pearl Harbor had been hiding in plain sight for decades, dismissed by historians, ignored by officials, and forgotten by the public? What if this vessel held secrets that could rewrite portions of America's understanding of December 7, 1941? The story of a particular shipwreck at Pearl Harbor challenges everything we thought we knew about that infamous day. For years, it sat beneath the waters of the harbor, passed over by diving expeditions, excluded from major documentaries, and absent from memorial discussions. Yet when researchers finally turned their attention to this forgotten wreck, they discovered something that sent shockwaves through the historical community. This vessel was not simply another casualty of the Japanese attack. It was a time capsule containing evidence that contradicted official narratives, personal effects that told untold stories, and structural secrets that revealed how unprepared America truly was on that fateful Sunday morning. The wreck in question is not the USS Arizona, whose memorial draws millions of visitors annually. It is not the USS Utah, resting beneath the waters on the western side of Ford Island. This is a vessel that historians walked past, both figuratively and literally, for more than 70 years. The reasons for this oversight are as compelling as the wreck itself, involving a combination of bureaucratic neglect, historical bias, and the simple fact that sometimes the most important stories are the ones nobody thinks to tell. When a team of marine archaeologists finally secured permission to conduct a comprehensive survey of this shipwreck in the early 2010s, they expected to document another war casualty. Instead, they found themselves standing at the threshold of a mystery that would consume years of research and challenge fundamental assumptions about the Pearl Harbor attack. The questions raised by this discovery extend far beyond a single sunken ship. They touch on how nations remember war, how bureaucracies process tragedy, and how the passage of time can obscure truths that should have been obvious from the beginning. This is not merely a story about naval archaeology or military history. It is a story about human memory, institutional failure, and the persistent power of physical evidence to challenge accepted narratives. The wreck demanded answers to questions that nobody had thought to ask, and in doing so, it opened new chapters in one of the most studied events in American history. Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, represented a turning point in American history. At approximately 7:48 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft descended upon the naval base, catching the United States Pacific Fleet almost entirely unprepared. Within 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans were dead, nearly 1,200 were wounded, and the American battleship fleet lay in ruins. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed, along with 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and numerous auxiliary vessels. The attack propelled the United States into World War II, transforming the nation from a reluctant observer to an active combatant in global conflict. The historical narrative of Pearl Harbor has been told and retold countless times. Books, films, documentaries, and academic papers have examined every conceivable angle of the attack. We know about the intelligence failures that prevented adequate warning. We understand the tactical brilliance of Admiral Yamamoto's planning. We have studied the heroism of individuals like Doris Miller, who manned an anti-aircraft gun despite having no training, and the tragedy of the Arizona, which lost 1,177 crew members when its forward magazine exploded. The story has been catalogued, analyzed, and memorialized to such an extent that it seems impossible any significant detail could remain undiscovered. Yet among the 18 vessels sunk or seriously damaged that day, one particular ship fell through the cracks of historical memory. This vessel was not a battleship with a crew of thousands. It was not a cruiser or destroyer that participated in dramatic last stands against attacking aircraft. It was a support vessel, the kind of ship that makes a navy function but rarely makes headlines. Its designation placed it in a category that historians often gloss over when recounting the glory and tragedy of combat. Support vessels are the workhorses of any fleet, essential to operations but seldom celebrated. This particular ship was moored in a location that put it directly in harm's way, yet its destruction received only passing mention in official reports. The ship's crew on that December morning consisted of both active-duty Navy personnel and civilian contractors. This mixed crew composition became significant in the decades following the attack, as the casualty lists and survivor accounts were compiled with an emphasis on military personnel. The civilians who died aboard this vessel were often recorded separately, their stories disconnected from the larger Pearl Harbor narrative. Some families never received full details about how their loved ones died. Others were told their relatives had perished in the attack, but were given no specifics about which vessel they had been on or what had happened to their remains. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the Navy faced an overwhelming task. Salvage operations focused on vessels that could be refloated and returned to service. The priority was military necessity, not historical preservation. Ships that could be repaired were raised, rebuilt, and sent back to war. Those deemed beyond salvation were often left where they sank, gradually fading from institutional memory. This particular wreck fell into the latter category. Early salvage assessments determined that the vessel was too damaged and too deeply embedded in the harbor bottom to be worth the effort of raising. Additionally, its location presented complications for salvage operations. It had settled in a position that made access difficult without disrupting other more critical recovery efforts. As the years passed, the wreck became part of the harbor's landscape. Divers occasionally visited it, but detailed surveys were not conducted. The focus of historical attention remained firmly fixed on the major warships, particularly the Arizona. When the Arizona Memorial was dedicated in 1962, it became the symbol of Pearl Harbor, drawing attention and resources that might otherwise have been distributed among the various wreck sites. Other vessels, including the USS Utah, eventually received recognition and memorials of their own, but this particular ship remained in obscurity. The turning point came in 2010, when a group of historians and archaeologists began advocating for a comprehensive survey of all Pearl Harbor wrecks. Their argument was that each vessel represented a unique historical document, a source of information that could not be obtained from written records alone. The physical evidence contained in these wrecks could answer questions about naval architecture, damage assessment, crew behavior during the attack, and the effectiveness of Japanese weaponry. Furthermore, advances in underwater archaeological techniques meant that surveys could now be conducted with minimal disturbance to the sites, preserving them even as they were studied. Securing funding and permission for the survey took several years. The Navy, which maintains jurisdiction over Pearl Harbor and its wrecks, was initially reluctant to approve extensive archaeological work on vessels other than those already recognized as memorials. Concerns about disturbing war graves were paramount. Additionally, there were practical considerations about how such research might affect ongoing naval operations in the harbor. Eventually, a compromise was reached. A limited survey would be conducted on several lesser-known wrecks, including the vessel in question, with strict protocols in place to ensure respectful treatment of any human remains encountered. The bureaucratic process of gaining approval highlighted one of the reasons the wreck had been overlooked for so long. Multiple agencies had jurisdiction over different aspects of Pearl Harbor, and coordinating between them required navigating complex regulations and competing priorities. The National Park Service, which manages the Arizona Memorial and parts of the historical site, had different concerns than the active duty Navy, which operates the naval base. State authorities in Hawaii had their own interests in historical preservation. Environmental agencies needed to ensure that archaeological work would not harm the marine ecosystem that had developed around the wrecks. Getting all these parties to agree on a research protocol was a monumental task in itself. The ship that would become one of Pearl Harbor's most overlooked casualties began its existence far from the waters of Hawaii. Constructed in the late 1930s at a shipyard on the East Coast, it was designed to fulfill a specific but unglamorous role in the expanding American Navy. The vessel was built as an auxiliary oiler, a ship whose primary function was to refuel other vessels while at sea. This capability was essential to the Navy's strategy of maintaining a mobile fleet capable of extended operations far from home ports. Without oilers, battleships and carriers would be tied to coastal facilities, their operational range severely limited. The design of the ship reflected the utilitarian nature of its mission. It was not armed for combat beyond basic defensive weapons. Its hull was constructed to maximize cargo capacity rather than speed or maneuverability. The vessel could carry thousands of barrels of fuel oil, along with supplies of aviation gasoline, lubricants, and other petroleum products essential to fleet operations. Its pumping systems were engineered to transfer fuel to other ships while both vessels were underway, a complex operation that required skilled seamanship and precise coordination. The construction process for the oiler took approximately 18 months, from the laying of the keel to final acceptance trials. During this period, the shipyard workers who built the vessel could not have imagined its fate. They were craftsmen focused on quality construction, ensuring that every weld was sound, every system properly installed, and every safety measure in place. The ship represented one of dozens of similar vessels being constructed as part of America's naval expansion in the late 1930s, a program driven by growing concerns about global instability and the need to project power across both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The crew selected for this vessel came from diverse backgrounds. The ship required both experienced Navy personnel and civilian specialists. The Navy men handled navigation, communications, and basic operations. The civilians were often experts in petroleum engineering, mechanics, and other technical fields necessary to manage the complex systems involved in fuel storage and transfer. This mixing of military and civilian personnel was common on auxiliary vessels, but created unique command structures and cultural dynamics aboard ship. Military discipline had to be balanced with the technical expertise that civilians brought, and effective captains learned to lead both groups while respecting their different perspectives and motivations. After its commissioning, the vessel conducted shakedown cruises along the Atlantic coast, testing its systems and training its crew. The ship performed well in these trials, meeting or exceeding design specifications. The crew drilled repeatedly on fuel transfer operations, fire suppression, damage control, and abandoned ship procedures. These exercises were taken seriously, though in the peacetime atmosphere of 1940, few could imagine they would soon be put to the test under actual combat conditions. In early 1941, as tensions with Japan escalated, the Navy made the decision to transfer the vessel to the Pacific Fleet. The journey through the Panama Canal and across to Hawaii represented the ship's first extended deployment. The crew adapted to life at sea, developing the routines and relationships that would define their service together. Upon arrival at Pearl Harbor, the oiler joined a fleet preparing for possible conflict. Throughout 1941, the Pacific Fleet conducted exercises and readiness drills, aware that war with Japan was increasingly likely. The oiler participated in these operations, refueling battleships and cruisers as they maneuvered in Hawaiian waters. The crew worked long hours maintaining their vessel and perfecting their refueling procedures. They knew their ship might not be glamorous, but they understood its importance to the fleet's operational capability. Without reliable fuel supplies, the powerful warships they serviced would be helpless, unable to carry out their missions or even defend themselves effectively. Life aboard the oiler settled into patterns familiar to sailors throughout history. There were watches to stand, equipment to maintain, and the endless cycle of cleaning and painting that keeps a ship in proper condition. The crew developed their own culture, with traditions, jokes, and hierarchies that newcomers had to learn. Some men thrived in this environment, finding camaraderie and purpose in naval service. Others struggled with the isolation, regimentation, and physical demands of shipboard life. Letters home reveal the full range of human experience aboard the vessel, from pride in serving the nation to homesickness and complaints about the food, the officers, or the monotony of routine operations. By December 1941, the vessel had been in Pacific waters for nearly a year. The crew had established a routine, with some men rotating back to the mainland while others extended their service. New personnel arrived regularly, including fresh Navy recruits and civilian contractors hired to support the expanding military presence in Hawaii. The ship itself had undergone minor modifications based on operational experience, with improvements made to its pumping systems and safety equipment. The crew had become proficient in their duties, able to conduct refueling operations efficiently even in challenging sea conditions. On December 6, 1941, the oiler was moored at a berth on the southeastern side of Ford Island. This location placed it near several other auxiliary vessels and repair facilities. The ship was not scheduled for sea duty on Sunday, December 7th. A skeleton crew remained aboard, while the majority of personnel were granted liberty, allowed to go ashore for the weekend. This was standard practice for vessels not immediately required for operations. The men aboard planned a quiet Sunday, perhaps catching up on maintenance tasks or simply enjoying the relative calm of harbor duty. The ship's position in the harbor, while seemingly unremarkable, would prove significant. It was moored in a location that gave it a clear view of Battleship Row, where the Pacific Fleet's heaviest warships were berthed. This proximity meant the crew would have an unobstructed view of the attack as it unfolded. It also meant the vessel itself would be visible to Japanese air crews, though whether it would be considered a priority target was unclear. Auxiliary ships were generally regarded as secondary objectives, less important than battleships, carriers, and cruisers. However, Japanese planning documents later revealed that enemy commanders understood the importance of fuel supplies and had instructed pilots to attack oilers and supply vessels if opportunities presented themselves. The evening of December 6th passed quietly aboard the oiler. Those on watch performed their duties without incident. The harbor was calm, with only normal traffic and activity. Some crew members wrote letters home, describing life in Hawaii and expressing hope they would be back in the States soon. Others played cards, read, or slept, conserving energy for whatever work the next day might bring. None suspected that within hours, their world would be transformed by fire and violence, and that the ship beneath their feet would become a footnote in one of history's most infamous attacks. The morning of December 7th began like any other Sunday at Pearl Harbor. The crew members aboard the oiler awoke to a typical tropical morning, warm and clear with light winds. Those on duty performed routine checks of the ship's systems, while others prepared breakfast or engaged in personal activities. The harbor was quiet, with most of the fleet's personnel enjoying their weekend liberty. On the surrounding ships, similar scenes played out, thousands of sailors and civilians going about their morning routines with no expectation that anything unusual was about to occur. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over the harbor. The sound of aircraft engines, initially dismissed by some as American planes conducting exercises, quickly gave way to the unmistakable sounds of combat. Explosions erupted across the harbor as bombs and torpedoes struck their targets. The crew of the oiler rushed to their stations, many still unsure of what was happening. Within moments, it became horrifyingly clear that Pearl Harbor was under attack. From their position, the crew had a panoramic view of the devastation unfolding on Battleship Row. They watched as the USS Oklahoma took torpedo hit after torpedo hit, eventually capsizing and trapping hundreds of men inside its hull. They saw the USS Arizona explode when a bomb penetrated its forward magazine, the blast so powerful that it created a fireball visible across the harbor. Other battleships, including the West Virginia and California, were struck repeatedly, settling into the harbor mud as water poured through gaping holes in their hulls. The Nevada attempted to get underway, making a valiant but ultimately unsuccessful bid to escape the harbor and avoid blocking the channel. The crew of the oiler responded as they had been trained, though training could never fully prepare anyone for such chaos. Men rushed to mount the ship's anti-aircraft guns, which consisted of a few machine guns intended primarily for defense against aircraft spotted at long range. These weapons were woefully inadequate against the swarm of Japanese planes now attacking the harbor, but the crew fired anyway, hoping to disrupt the attackers' runs or at least demonstrate that they would not die passively. The staccato bark of machine guns joined the cacophony of explosions, aircraft engines, and shouted orders that filled the air. The ship's position, while giving it a view of the larger battle, also made it vulnerable. Japanese pilots, having struck the primary targets on Battleship Row, began seeking secondary objectives. Auxiliary vessels, while not priority targets, were still legitimate military assets. A group of aircraft, having expended their torpedoes on the battleships, turned their attention to the ships moored near Ford Island's southeastern shore. The oiler, with its distinctive profile and visible fuel storage tanks, became a target. What happened next is reconstructed from survivor accounts and Japanese records. A bomb, likely released by a dive bomber that had already attacked other targets, struck the oiler amidships. The weapon was not one of the massive armor-piercing bombs designed to penetrate battleship decks, but rather a general-purpose bomb intended for use against lighter vessels and shore installations. The explosion tore through the ship's deck and penetrated into the cargo spaces below, where thousands of gallons of fuel were stored. Remarkably, the fuel did not immediately ignite. The bomb's trajectory and the specific type of fuel in the damaged compartments meant that while there was significant structural damage and the ship began taking on water, the catastrophic fire that might have been expected did not materialize. This was both fortunate and tragic. It was fortunate because it prevented an immediate inferno that would have killed everyone aboard instantly. It was tragic because it meant the ship sank slowly enough that the crew had to make agonizing decisions about abandoning ship while under continued attack. The crew attempted damage control, working to shore up bulkheads and pump out flooding compartments. However, The extent of the damage quickly became apparent. The bomb had compromised the structural integrity of the hull, and water was entering faster than pumps could remove it. The ship began listing to port, the deck tilting beneath the crew's feet as thousands of tons of seawater displaced air in the damaged sections. Equipment broke loose from its moorings, sliding across angled decks and creating additional hazards. The ship's commanding officer, recognizing that the vessel was doomed, ordered the crew to abandon ship. This order came during a brief lull in the attack, as Japanese aircraft regrouped and prepared for a second wave. Abandoning a sinking ship in the middle of a combat zone presented enormous challenges. The crew had to reach the water safely, avoiding debris and potential fires, then swim to shore while oil and wreckage filled the harbor. Some men were injured, either from the initial explosion or from anti-aircraft fire from nearby vessels that sometimes fell back into the harbor. The waters around Pearl Harbor that morning were a nightmare of burning oil, sinking ships, and desperate men trying to reach safety. The oiler's crew members who made it into the water faced a swim of several hundred yards to reach solid ground, all while explosions continued around them, and the possibility existed that Japanese planes might strafe swimmers in the water. Not everyone made it off the oiler. Some crew members were killed by the initial bomb strike, their bodies torn apart by the explosion or crushed by falling debris. Others were trapped below decks as the ship settled, caught in compartments where hatches had been damaged or where flooding happened too quickly to allow escape. A few chose to remain aboard, attempting to the last moment to save their ship or assist wounded shipmates who could not be moved. The exact number of casualties was difficult to determine in the immediate aftermath, as chaos reigned throughout the harbor and casualty reporting systems were overwhelmed. The oiler sank slowly, taking several hours to fully settle on the harbor bottom. By the time it came to rest, the Japanese attack was over, and the harbor was beginning the grim process of assessing the damage and searching for survivors. The oiler, having joined the ranks of sunken vessels, was noted in casualty reports but quickly overshadowed by the scale of destruction inflicted on the battleship fleet. In official records, it was listed as sunk, its crew accounted for as best as possible under the circumstances, and then attention moved to more pressing matters. The survivors of the oiler, scattered across the harbor and shore facilities, each carried their own trauma from the experience. Some had watched friends die in the explosion. Others had pulled wounded shipmates from the water, only to lose them despite their best efforts. Many suffered burns from fires or hot metal, injuries from shrapnel or debris, or the physical and psychological effects of near drowning. In the days following the attack, these survivors were debriefed, given medical treatment, and eventually reassigned to other duties. Some remained in Hawaii, serving on other vessels or at shore installations. Others were sent back to the mainland, either because their injuries required extended treatment or because the Navy needed experienced personnel to help commission new ships being built in response to the Pearl Harbor disaster. The story of this particular wreck illuminates several broader themes about how we remember war and honor sacrifice. The first and most obvious theme is the hierarchy of commemoration. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the Navy and the nation focused their grief and attention on the vessels that represented American naval power, the battleships. These massive warships, symbols of national strength, became the central figures in Pearl Harbor's narrative. The Arizona, with its enormous death toll and dramatic destruction, became the ultimate symbol. Other battleships that were sunk or damaged received varying degrees of attention based on factors like crew casualties, the vessel's history, and whether it was eventually returned to service. Auxiliary vessels, by contrast, received far less attention. This was not necessarily a deliberate slight, but rather a reflection of how naval culture values different types of ships. Battleships and carriers are the capital ships, the vessels that define a fleet's combat capability. Cruisers and destroyers, while smaller, are still recognized as warships with proud traditions. Auxiliary vessels, despite their essential role in enabling fleet operations, occupy a lower tier in this hierarchy. They are the logistical support, necessary but unglamorous. This cultural valuation inevitably shaped how losses were remembered. The mixed military-civilian crew aboard the oiler also contributed to its marginalization in historical memory. Military casualties were systematically recorded and memorialized through established processes. Civilian contractors who died in the attack were also recorded, but their stories were often separated from the military narrative. The civilian victims of Pearl Harbor have received less attention than their military counterparts, a pattern repeated in many conflicts where non-combatants are killed in military zones. The families of civilian casualties often found themselves navigating bureaucratic systems that were not designed to accommodate their loss, receiving less support and recognition than military families. Another factor in the overlooking of this wreck was its location. Vessels that sank in highly visible locations or that could be easily accessed became natural focuses of attention. The Arizona, for example, sits in a position that allowed for the construction of a memorial straddling its hull. The Utah, moored on the far side of Ford Island, is visible from certain vantage points and has its own memorial marker. The oiler sank in a location that was less accessible and less visible, contributing to its gradual disappearance from public consciousness. The passage of time also played a role. In the immediate post-war years, there was intense interest in Pearl Harbor as the event that brought America into World War II. However, as the war receded into history and new conflicts emerged, public attention shifted. The veterans of Pearl Harbor aged, and their first-hand accounts became less common. Memorial efforts consolidated around the major sites, particularly the Arizona Memorial. Lesser-known sites received less funding, fewer visitors, and diminishing attention from historians and preservationists. This pattern of selective memory extends beyond Pearl Harbor to how societies remember war generally. Certain events, battles, and individuals become fixed in collective memory while others fade. The factors determining what is remembered are complex, involving a mix of casualty numbers, strategic significance, cultural narratives about heroism and sacrifice, and sometimes simple chance. A story that captures public imagination at the right moment may be told and retold, becoming canonical. A story that emerges at the wrong time or lacks the right elements may be forgotten, regardless of its intrinsic significance. The concept of worthy victims versus unworthy victims applies here, though not in the sense of moral worth, but rather in terms of commemorative attention. Certain types of casualties receive more recognition than others, based on factors that have little to do with the actual sacrifice made. A sailor who died aboard the Arizona is no more or less a hero than one who died aboard the oiler, yet the former is more likely to be remembered simply because of which ship he happened to be assigned to. This disparity reflects broader patterns in how societies construct collective memory, often privileging certain narratives over others. The bureaucratic dimension of remembrance also shaped the oiler's fate. In the Navy's organizational structure, auxiliary vessels report through different command channels than combatant ships. Their administrative records are maintained separately, and their histories are documented by different offices. This bureaucratic separation meant that when historians researched Pearl Harbor, they naturally gravitated toward the records of fighting ships, where the most dramatic action occurred. The administrative files of auxiliary vessels received less scrutiny, and inconsistencies or gaps in those records were less likely to be noticed or investigated. Media coverage of Pearl Harbor also influenced what was remembered. In the days and weeks after the attack, newspapers and radio reports focused on the battleships and the overall strategic impact of the raid. Stories of individual heroism tended to feature personnel from major warships or prominent shore installations. The oiler and its crew simply did not fit the narrative frames that journalists and editors used to make sense of the attack. Later media treatments, including films and documentaries, replicated these early patterns, cementing certain aspects of Pearl Harbor in public consciousness while allowing others to fade. Educational materials about Pearl Harbor showed similar patterns. Textbooks devoted paragraphs to the Arizona and Oklahoma, but might mention auxiliary vessels only in passing, if at all. Museum exhibits focused on artifacts from major warships. Documentary footage showed the dramatic images of battleships burning and capsizing, not the less visually spectacular sinking of support vessels. Generation after generation of students learned about Pearl Harbor through materials that systematically emphasized certain aspects of the story while minimizing others. When the archaeological team finally received authorization to survey the wreck in 2012, they approached the site with a combination of professional curiosity and respect for the gravesite it represented. The team consisted of marine archaeologists, Navy historians, and technical specialists in underwater documentation. Their mission was to conduct a comprehensive survey of the wreck, documenting its current condition, assessing its historical significance, and determining whether any conservation measures were necessary. The initial survey dives were conducted using minimally invasive techniques. Divers mapped the wreck using sonar and photogrammetry, creating detailed three-dimensional models without disturbing the site. The first images revealed a vessel that had been significantly damaged by both the initial attack and decades of gradual deterioration. The hull was broken in several places, with sections collapsed inward. Coral and other marine growth covered much of the structure, transforming the steel wreck into an artificial reef that now supported a diverse ecosystem of fish, invertebrates, and other marine organisms. As the survey progressed, the team began to notice features that were unexpected. The pattern of damage to the hull did not entirely match what would be expected from a single bomb hit. There appeared to be multiple breach points, suggesting either that the vessel had been struck more than once, or that secondary explosions had occurred after the initial hit. This finding was significant because it contradicted the brief official reports from December 7th, which mentioned only a single bomb strike. If the ship had indeed been hit multiple times, it suggested that Japanese pilots had specifically targeted the oiler rather than simply hitting it opportunistically while aiming at nearby vessels. Further investigation revealed evidence that challenged other aspects of the accepted narrative. Personal effects found within the wreck suggested that more crew members had been aboard at the time of the attack than official records indicated. The team discovered items in locations that should have been unoccupied, according to duty rosters from that morning. Bunks in berthing areas that should have been empty contained personal belongings. Work areas showed signs of recent use, despite not being listed as manned on the duty roster. This raised questions about how accurately the chaos of December 7th had been recorded and whether some crew members might have been overlooked in casualty reports. The most startling discovery came when archaeologists examined the ship's magazines and ammunition storage areas. Despite being an auxiliary vessel not intended for combat, the oiler had been carrying a significant quantity of small arms ammunition and possibly explosives. This was not mentioned in pre-attack records and suggested that the ship's role had expanded beyond simple refueling operations. The presence of this ordnance raised new questions about what the oiler was actually doing in the days before the attack and whether it had been prepared for missions beyond its official designation. Were these supplies intended for the oiler's own defense, or was the ship being used to transport ammunition to other locations? Archival research conducted in parallel with the underwater survey began to uncover documents that had been overlooked in previous studies of Pearl Harbor. The research team discovered maintenance logs, crew correspondence, and operational orders that painted a more complex picture of the oiler's activities in late 1941. It became clear that the vessel had been involved in several classified operations in the months before the attack, including support for submarine operations and potentially reconnaissance missions. These activities were not reflected in the standard histories of Pearl Harbor, which had relied on more accessible but less complete sources. The archaeologists also found evidence of salvage operations that had never been officially recorded. In the weeks and months after December 7th, various efforts were made to remove valuable equipment and materials from sunken vessels. Some of these operations were official Navy salvage efforts, documented and systematic. Others were less formal, conducted by individual sailors or salvage teams working without clear authorization. The oiler showed signs of having been visited repeatedly by salvagers, with certain compartments stripped of equipment, while others remained untouched. This suggested that someone had known what was aboard and had prioritized removing specific items, possibly including classified materials or valuable equipment that could be reused on other vessels. One particularly intriguing find was a locked safe in what had been the captain's quarters. The safe had been damaged by the attack and subsequent corrosion, but remained sealed. The archaeological team faced an ethical and practical dilemma. Should they attempt to open the safe and examine its contents, or should they leave it undisturbed? After consultation with Navy officials and ethics committees, the decision was made to carefully extract and open the safe under controlled conditions, with the contents to be immediately preserved and catalogued. The extraction operation took several days, requiring specialized equipment to cut the safe free from the wreck without damaging it further or disturbing human remains that might be nearby. When the safe was finally opened in a conservation laboratory, it contained documents that provided insight into the oiler's classified missions. There were coded messages, some of which could still be deciphered using period cryptographic keys available in archives. These messages revealed that the oiler had been involved in supporting intelligence-gathering operations, including providing fuel to vessels engaged in monitoring Japanese naval movements. The ship had also been designated as a potential evacuation vessel for sensitive personnel if the Philippines or other forward bases came under attack, though this contingency plan had never been activated before the Pearl Harbor raid made such evacuation plans moot. Additionally, the safe contained personal items belonging to the ship's captain, including letters from his family and a journal that documented his final weeks. The journal entries provided a rare first-hand perspective on life aboard the oiler in the days before the attack. The captain wrote about the growing tension in the fleet, the awareness that war was coming, and his concerns about whether his ship and crew were adequately prepared. He also expressed frustration with what he perceived as insufficient attention paid to auxiliary vessels in readiness planning, noting that while battleships conducted frequent drills and received priority for equipment and supplies, support ships were expected to simply carry on with routine operations, using whatever resources were available. The captain's journal also revealed his thoughts about his crew, both military and civilian. He wrote with obvious respect for the men under his command, noting their dedication and professionalism even in unglamorous work. He worried about the civilians, who lacked military training and might not know how to respond in combat situations. He had tried to incorporate them into damage control drills, but regulations limited how much military training civilians could receive. The captain's concerns proved tragically prescient when the attack came and some civilians aboard were unsure of what to do or where to go when combat began. The archaeological findings prompted a comprehensive review of Pearl Harbor records. Historians began to realize how much information about auxiliary vessels had been either lost or never properly collected in the first place. The focus on capital ships in the immediate post-attack period had resulted in less rigorous documentation of what happened to support vessels. Casualty lists for the oiler were re-examined and found to contain errors and omissions. Several families were contacted with new information about the fate of their relatives, more than 70 years after the attack. For some families, this brought closure. For others, it reopened old wounds, forcing them to confront losses they thought they had processed decades earlier. The research team also discovered that some crew members who survived the oiler's sinking had gone on to notable service later in the war. One machinist's mate who had been pulled from the water that morning eventually served aboard a destroyer escort in the Atlantic, participating in the Battle of the Atlantic and earning commendations for his service. Another survivor transferred to submarine duty and completed multiple war patrols in the Pacific, surviving the entire conflict and retiring as a senior chief petty officer. These men had never spoken publicly about their Pearl Harbor experience, apparently considering it just one chapter in their wartime service rather than something that defined their military careers. The comprehensive study of the wreck and associated archival research ultimately revealed several significant facts that changed how historians understand both this particular vessel and Pearl Harbor more broadly. First, it became clear that the oiler had been struck multiple times during the attack, not just once as initially reported. Evidence of at least 3 separate bomb or strafe hits was found, indicating that Japanese aircraft had specifically targeted the vessel rather than hitting it incidentally while aiming at other targets. This suggested that enemy pilots recognized the strategic importance of fuel supplies and deliberately sought to destroy oiling capacity alongside combat vessels. The multiple hits explained the extensive damage to the ship and why it sank relatively quickly, despite not suffering a catastrophic explosion. The first bomb strike penetrated the main deck and damaged fuel storage compartments, causing flooding and a list to port. The second hit appears to have struck near the stern, damaging the steering gear and propulsion systems, ensuring the ship could not be moved even if pumps could control the flooding. The third hit, based on damage patterns, likely struck near the bow, accelerating the flooding and making the vessel's fate inevitable. Japanese after-action reports, when cross-referenced with the archaeological evidence, confirmed that multiple aircraft had attacked the oiler, viewing it as a worthwhile target, despite its secondary status compared to battleships. Second, the investigation revealed that casualty figures for the oiler had been significantly underreported. Official records listed 17 deaths aboard the vessel, but the archaeological and archival evidence suggested the true number was closer to 28, possibly as high as 32 when accounting for men who died of injuries in the days following the attack. The discrepancy arose from several factors: civilian contractors whose deaths were recorded separately from military casualties, crew members who died of their injuries days or weeks after the attack and were not counted as direct Pearl Harbor casualties, and at least 3 individuals who appeared to have been aboard the ship unofficially on December 7th, possibly visiting friends or conducting unauthorized business. The presence of unauthorized personnel aboard the oiler reflected broader patterns in how Pearl Harbor operated on that fatal Sunday. With so many ships in port and the weekend liberty policy in effect, movement between vessels was common and not always strictly controlled. Sailors might visit friends on other ships. Civilian contractors might check on equipment they had installed or maintained on multiple vessels, and various informal interactions occurred that would never appear in official logs. When the attack came, these informal movements created confusion in casualty accounting, as some victims were on ships they had no official reason to be on, while others who were listed as aboard certain vessels were actually elsewhere when the attack began. The discovery of ammunition and explosives aboard the vessel provided evidence that auxiliary ships were being quietly armed and prepared for combat roles beyond their official designations. This reflected a broader pattern of improvisation within the Pacific Fleet as tensions with Japan escalated. Ships were being adapted for multiple roles, with flexibility prioritized over rigid adherence to design specifications. The oiler had apparently been modified to support commando or reconnaissance operations, carrying munitions that could be quickly transferred to small boats or submarines for clandestine missions. This armament also made the ship more dangerous when attacked, as the ammunition stores could potentially detonate or contribute to fires, though fortunately this did not occur during the December 7th attack. The wreck also provided physical evidence about the effectiveness of Japanese munitions and tactics. The damage patterns allowed weapons experts to analyze how different types of bombs performed against various types of vessels. While much analysis had been conducted on battleship damage, less data was available about how attacks affected lighter vessels. The oiler's wreck showed that even non-armor-piercing bombs could be devastating against thin-hulled auxiliary ships, and that the positioning of fuel and ammunition stores made such vessels particularly vulnerable to catastrophic secondary explosions, even if such explosions did not occur in this particular case. Perhaps most significantly, the investigation revealed that some classified intelligence documents had gone down with the ship. The papers found in the captain's safe were only a portion of what had been aboard. References in recovered documents pointed to other materials that had been in the ship's communications center or intelligence office, areas that were now completely destroyed or buried under debris. These lost documents might have contained information about American intelligence capabilities and Japanese military movements in the days before Pearl Harbor. Their destruction represented a loss of historical evidence about what American commanders knew or suspected before the attack, and how that intelligence was being processed and distributed through the fleet. The wreck investigation also provided new insights into the human experience of the attack. Personal effects found throughout the ship painted an intimate picture of life aboard. Letters, photographs, personal journals, and small mementos revealed the backgrounds, thoughts, and concerns of the men who served on this unglamorous vessel. Many were young men on their first major deployment, excited about serving their country, but also homesick and uncertain about the future. Others were veteran sailors who had chosen service on an auxiliary vessel for its relative safety and predictability compared to a battleship or cruiser, only to find themselves in the middle of one of history's most devastating naval attacks. Their personal items, preserved in the anaerobic environment of the sealed compartments, provided a direct connection to these individuals and their lives. Archaeological evidence also shed light on crew behavior during the attack. The distribution of equipment and personal items suggested that some men had attempted to reach damage control stations, while others had moved to assist wounded shipmates or fight fires. A concentration of life jackets in one area indicated a staging point where crew members had gathered before abandoning ship. The location of several bodies, identified through personal effects, showed that some men had been trapped by falling debris or flooding compartments, unable to escape despite being close to potential exit points. One sailor's remains were found in a position suggesting he had been trying to force open a jammed hatch, likely attempting to rescue someone trapped on the other side. The investigation uncovered evidence of heroism that had never been officially recognized. One crew member, a machinist's mate, had apparently remained at his station operating pumps, even as the ship was sinking, buying time for others to evacuate. His body was found at his duty station, hands still positioned as though operating equipment, a testament to his commitment to his duty and his shipmates even in the face of certain death. Another sailor had been in a position suggesting he was helping someone else when both were killed, likely by a secondary explosion or structural collapse. These individual acts of courage, unremarked at the time and unrecorded in official reports, were now documented through archaeological evidence, ensuring that these men's final sacrifices would be known and honored. The wreck also revealed information about the ship's final moments. The rate and pattern of sinking could be reconstructed from how equipment and debris were distributed throughout the vessel. The ship had initially listed to port after the first bomb hit, then gradually settled by the stern as flooding progressed. The crew's abandoned ship effort had been relatively orderly given the circumstances, with most personnel evacuating through designated routes despite the ongoing attack and the ship's unstable condition. The captain and several senior personnel had remained aboard until nearly the end, ensuring all possible survivors were evacuated before finally leaving the ship themselves. The captain's body was never recovered, suggesting he may have gone down with his vessel or died in the water during the swim to shore, his final resting place unknown. The rediscovery and proper study of this wreck had implications that extended well beyond the specific vessel. It prompted historians to re-examine how they had approached Pearl Harbor research. The focus on major warships and high-ranking officers had created a somewhat distorted picture of the attack, one that emphasized certain types of experiences while marginalizing others. The men and women who served on auxiliary vessels, in shore facilities, and in support roles were just as much a part of Pearl Harbor's story, even if their experiences did not fit neatly into narratives about battleship duels and carrier aircraft. This realization led to a broader effort to document and preserve all Pearl Harbor wrecks, not just those already recognized as memorials. Each wreck was acknowledged as a unique historical resource, containing information that could not be obtained from documents alone. A comprehensive survey of all submerged sites in the harbor was initiated, with teams methodically documenting vessels, aircraft, and equipment that had been destroyed on December 7th. This work revealed numerous previously unknown details about the attack and its aftermath, filling gaps in the historical record and correcting errors that had persisted for decades. The project also prompted questions about commemoration and who deserves to be remembered. Should memorial efforts focus on the sites with the highest casualties, or should they strive for more equitable recognition of all who died? What obligations do we have to the families of victims whose stories were overlooked? How should nations balance the practicalities of memorial maintenance and public access with the goal of inclusive remembrance? These questions have no easy answers, but the overlooked oiler wreck brought them into sharp focus and forced the historical community to confront uncomfortable truths about how commemorative choices are made. The investigation raised awareness about the losses suffered by civilian contractors during the attack. More than 100 civilians were killed at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, working in shipyards, on vessels, and at various facilities around the harbor. Their stories have received far less attention than those of military personnel, despite their sacrifice being equally real. Many were skilled tradesmen who had come to Hawaii for good-paying defense jobs, bringing their families and building lives in the islands. When they died in the attack, their families faced not only grief, but also complicated bureaucratic processes to secure death benefits and recognition. Efforts began to more properly recognize civilian casualties, including adding their names to memorials and conducting oral history interviews with families who had lost loved ones. The wreck project also contributed to advances in underwater archaeology methodology. The Pearl Harbor environment presents unique challenges, including poor visibility, strong currents, restricted access due to ongoing military operations, and the sensitivity of working on war graves. Techniques developed for surveying the oiler and other Pearl Harbor wrecks have since been applied to shipwreck investigations around the world. Non-invasive documentation methods that allow comprehensive study while preserving site integrity have become increasingly sophisticated, enabling archaeologists to extract maximum information while minimizing disturbance. Remote sensing technologies, including multi-beam sonar, side-scan sonar, and photogrammetry, have advanced significantly through projects like this one. From a military history perspective, the findings about the oilers' expanded role and the presence of classified operations added nuance to understanding of American preparations before Pearl Harbor. The narrative of the attack has often emphasized American unpreparedness, presenting the Pacific Fleet as caught completely off guard. While the attack was certainly a surprise in terms of timing and tactics, evidence from the oiler and other sources suggested that the fleet had been taking steps to prepare for possible conflict. The problem was not complete unpreparedness, but rather that preparations were insufficient, and that important vulnerabilities, particularly regarding auxiliary vessels and support infrastructure, had not been adequately addressed. The investigation also provided data for naval architects and defense planners studying vessel survivability, understanding how ships respond to combat damage, how crews react under attack conditions, and what design features contribute to survival or doom has practical value for modern naval construction. While technology has advanced dramatically since 1941, basic principles of naval architecture and damage control remain relevant. The Pearl Harbor wrecks serve as a laboratory for studying these principles under actual combat conditions, providing insights that cannot be obtained from simulations or tests. The project highlighted the importance of physical evidence in historical research. Documents can be incomplete, inaccurate, or systematically biased in ways that researchers might not recognize. Archaeological evidence provides an independent check on documentary sources, revealing details that were never recorded or correcting errors in official accounts. The combination of archaeological and documentary research produces a more complete and accurate understanding than either approach alone. This lesson has implications for historical research in general, not just maritime archaeology or military history. The project to study overlooked Pearl Harbor wrecks has not been without controversy. Some critics argued that disturbing war graves, even for archaeological purposes, was disrespectful to the dead. Veterans groups and some families of Pearl Harbor casualties expressed concern that archaeological work might be motivated more by academic curiosity than by genuine respect for the sacrifice memorialized at these sites. These concerns were taken seriously, and extensive consultation was conducted before and during the research to ensure that work was conducted in a manner consistent with the site's status as military cemeteries. Protocols were established requiring that any human remains encountered be treated with utmost respect, that religious and cultural sensitivities be honored, and that families of identified casualties be notified and consulted about research findings. Others questioned whether resources devoted to studying lesser-known wrecks might be better spent on maintaining and improving existing memorials like the USS Arizona. Preservation work at major memorial sites is ongoing and expensive, requiring constant maintenance to prevent deterioration of structures exposed to harsh marine environments. Some argued that attention and funding should be concentrated there rather than dispersed across multiple projects. Proponents of comprehensive wreck documentation argued that understanding the full scope of Pearl Harbor required studying all aspects of the attack, not just the most famous sites, and that overlooked stories deserved to be told even if they were less dramatic than the Arizona's destruction. There were also debates within the historical community about how much the new findings actually changed understanding of Pearl Harbor. Skeptics pointed out that the basic narrative of the attack had not been fundamentally altered. The Japanese still achieved surprise, the Pacific Fleet was still devastated, and America was still propelled into World War II. The fact that one particular auxiliary vessel had been hit multiple times rather than once, or that casualty figures needed to be adjusted by a few dozen, did not rewrite the larger story. Supporters of the research countered that history is built from accumulation of details, that every corrected error and recovered story makes our understanding more complete and more accurate, and that dismissing such corrections as insignificant reflects a troubling indifference to truth. The question of what to do with objects recovered from the wrecks generated ethical discussions. Should personal effects be kept in archives for research purposes, or should efforts be made to return them to families? Should artifacts be displayed in museums, or would doing so constitute exploitation of tragedy? Different parties held different views, reflecting broader debates in archaeology and museum studies about the proper treatment of culturally sensitive materials. Ultimately, a case-by-case approach was adopted. with some items retained for research and eventual museum display, while others were returned to families who could be identified and contacted. Items of particular religious or personal significance were prioritized for return to families, while objects that provided important historical information but lacked strong personal associations were retained for study and potential display. The project also highlighted ongoing tensions about how Pearl Harbor should be remembered and commemorated. There is a natural tendency to focus on valor and sacrifice, to emphasize the heroism of defenders and the eventual American victory in the broader war. This commemorative approach can sometimes obscure harder questions about the failures of leadership, intelligence, and preparedness that contributed to the disaster. Some historians involved in the Wreck project argued that proper remembrance requires confronting uncomfortable truths about American vulnerability and the mistakes that were made, not just celebrating courage in response to attack. Others worried that excessive focus on failures could dishonor the memory of those who died or detract from recognition of their sacrifice. The discovery that some casualties had been overlooked or misidentified for more than 70 years raised questions about the accuracy of historical records more generally. If errors existed in documentation of an event as thoroughly studied as Pearl Harbor, what other mistakes might be lurking in historical accounts of other events? This realization prompted some historians to become more skeptical of official records and more diligent in seeking corroborating evidence from multiple sources. It also highlighted the importance of physical evidence and archaeology as checks against documentary bias and error. However, critics worried that excessive skepticism toward documents might lead historians to dismiss legitimate records in favor of speculative interpretations of material evidence. Finally, the project prompted reflection on the nature of historical memory itself. Why do some events and people get remembered while others are forgotten? What factors determine which stories become part of collective consciousness and which fade into obscurity? The overlooked oiler wreck served as a case study in how organizational priorities, media coverage, and cultural narratives shape what we remember about the past. It demonstrated that forgetting is not simply a passive process, but involves active choices about what to commemorate, study, and teach to future generations. These choices reflect values and priorities that may shift over time, meaning that historical memory is constantly being negotiated and renegotiated. The story of the overlooked Pearl Harbor wreck illustrates fundamental truths about history, memory, and the importance of continued inquiry. No historical event, no matter how thoroughly studied, is ever completely understood. New evidence, new methods, and new questions can always reveal aspects that were previously hidden or ignored. The wreck that lay forgotten for decades at Pearl Harbor was always there, a silent witness to the events of December 7, 1941. What changed was not the wreck itself, but rather the attention paid to it and the willingness to ask why it had been overlooked. The men who served aboard this vessel were every bit as much heroes as those on more famous ships. They answered their nation's call, served in difficult and unglamorous roles, and died defending their country when it was attacked. That their sacrifice was not immediately recognized with memorials and ceremonies does not diminish what they did. History has now corrected this oversight, ensuring that these men and their ship are properly remembered and honored. Their names have been added to memorial rolls, their families have been provided with long overdue information, and their story has taken its rightful place in the Pearl Harbor narrative. The vessel itself, still resting on the harbor bottom, has been designated as a protected site. While it has not received a memorial structure like the Arizona, it is now included in educational materials about Pearl Harbor and is recognized by the Navy as a war grave deserving of respect and protection. Divers occasionally visit the site under strictly controlled conditions, and the three-dimensional models created during archaeological surveys are available for study by researchers and the public. The wreck has been preserved digitally, ensuring that even as the physical structure continues to deteriorate, our understanding of what it represents will not be lost. The broader lesson of this story extends beyond Pearl Harbor and even beyond military history. It speaks to the importance of questioning assumptions, seeking overlooked evidence, and recognizing that every person's story has value. In any historical event, there are always lesser-known participants whose experiences have not been fully documented. Finding and telling these stories enriches our understanding of the past and honors the full spectrum of human experience during significant events. It reminds us that history is not just about famous people and dramatic moments, but also about ordinary individuals doing their duty in extraordinary circumstances. The archaeological work at Pearl Harbor continues, with additional wrecks still being surveyed and studied. Each investigation adds to our knowledge of the attack and its aftermath. The process is slow and painstaking, requiring patience, respect, and meticulous attention to detail. But the results justify the effort, providing insights that document research alone could never achieve, and ensuring that those who died defending Pearl Harbor are all remembered, not just those aboard the most famous vessels. Future generations will benefit from this work, gaining a more complete and accurate understanding of what happened on December 7, 1941. The project has also inspired similar efforts at other historical sites. Overlooked wrecks from other conflicts are being rediscovered and studied, with researchers applying lessons learned at Pearl Harbor to investigations around the world. World War II sites in the Pacific and Atlantic, ships from earlier conflicts, and even vessels from more recent wars are receiving archaeological attention that was previously focused only on the most famous casualties. This democratization of historical attention represents a maturation of how we approach the past, recognizing that significance is not determined solely by fame or casualty numbers, but by the human stories each site contains. In the end, the overlooked shipwreck at Pearl Harbor reminds us that history is not a fixed narrative, but an ongoing conversation between past and present. We continually reinterpret past events as we gain new information and as our own perspectives evolve. What seems unimportant in one era may be recognized as significant in another. The wreck waited patiently beneath the waters of Pearl Harbor for historians to realize its importance, to recognize that it had stories to tell and lessons to teach. Now that those stories have been heard and those lessons learned, the vessel and its crew have finally received the recognition they always deserved. The families of those who died aboard the oiler have expressed gratitude for the research that finally provided them with answers about their loved ones' fates. Some families had spent decades wondering exactly what had happened, where their relatives had been when the attack came, and whether they had suffered. The archaeological work provided closure, even though it came long after most immediately affected family members had passed away. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the casualties now know their ancestors' stories and can honor their memory with accurate knowledge rather than speculation. The oiler's story has been incorporated into Pearl Harbor educational programs, ensuring that future visitors will learn about all aspects of the attack, not just the most famous incidents. School curricula are being updated to include information about auxiliary vessels and the full range of casualties suffered on December 7th. Documentary filmmakers are producing new content that tells the stories of overlooked ships and personnel. Academic conferences on Pearl Harbor now routinely include presentations on auxiliary vessels and support personnel, reflecting a more comprehensive approach to understanding the attack. The wreck has become a symbol of the importance of thorough historical investigation and the value of every individual's contribution to significant events. It stands as a reminder that fame and glory are poor measures of true significance, and that the humble support personnel who make operations possible deserve recognition alongside the more visible combatants. The oiler and its crew may never receive the public attention lavished on battleships and aircraft carriers, but within the historical community, their story is now recognized as an essential part of understanding Pearl Harbor. The project has demonstrated that even for well-studied events, there are always new discoveries to be made and new perspectives to be gained. History is not a closed book, but an ongoing investigation requiring constant questioning and re-evaluation. The tools and methods available to historians continue to improve, enabling them to extract information from sources that previous generations could not access. As technology advances, we can expect further discoveries at Pearl Harbor and other historical sites, each adding to our collective understanding of the past. The shipwreck is no longer overlooked. It has become a powerful reminder that every sacrifice matters, every story deserves to be told, and that sometimes the most important historical discoveries are the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting patiently for someone to ask the right questions and look in the right places. The crew of this forgotten oiler has finally received the recognition they earned on December 7, 1941, when they stood at their posts and did their duty as their ship was destroyed around them. Their legacy, reclaimed from decades of obscurity, now stands as a testament to the courage and dedication of all who served that day, famous or forgotten, on battleships or oilers, in the spotlight or in the shadows.